Well, okay, folks, let's do this. David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. It is the year 2025. I am very happy to bring you this interview with David Humphries. We'll get to that in a second. I don't know about you, but I have been thinking a lot about the twin truck terror incidents that started off this new year. It's hard not to look at that picture of an exploded Tesla Cybertruck outside of the gates of Trump Tower. What a picture. It's like a Pulitzer Prize winning image, honestly, in the way that it captures something that we've been trying to get at on Nostalgia Trap for a long time, and I think will come out in today's episode, actually. And certainly as we enter the Trump era part 2, which is, I don't know, the connections between technology and feeling like absolute shit, right? Like, it's the new year. I will be honest, I'm not feeling too great. I think I've got the hangover of credit card debt, student loan debt, looking at all of this stuff online and trying to figure out deferments and balance transfers and how I'm going to make payments is something that honestly gets me down. It's got me down right now. I've been thinking about it all morning. I've been having bad dreams about debt. And if I'm having that, then I'm thinking about how does all of that stuff filter into a mind that has been perhaps fucked up by going to military adventers in Afghanistan. Both of these guys that did this truck terror stuff did tours in Afghanistan, are Army veterans. It's a weird moment, and I can't help but think about the truck as a sort of symbol of a particular mode of violence in America. It's got, it's definitely got that Mad Max shit going on, but I don't know. I live in a town I've mentioned many times that's filled with dudes in big trucks with really antagonistic, borderline violent bumper stickers on them that say shit like, "This truck runs on Trump's cum, and if you don't like that, fuck you, you liberal pussy. I'm loading my AR-15 to go do a mass shooting at a kindergarten, and if you don't like that," that's the sort of vibe. I know they don't say exactly those words, but that's the sort of vibe I get from these trucks. And, sitting here looking at the news of trucks being used to express violence towards whatever the American public is, whatever is left of the American public, is something I'm thinking about as we head into Trump taking over again, because I don't know if this is actually borne out by the statistics, but it seems like the 4 years in which Trump was president, there were lots of really, really ugly, spectacular acts of terror by these types of dudes, right? There was the Las Vegas shooting happened. I think that's the largest mass shooting in American history, the Mandalay Bay thing that people just don't want to talk about, and who can blame them? But I think also for me personally here in Ventura County, the Borderline shooting happened. I still, speaking of bumper stickers, I still see all sorts of Borderline strong and Ventura strong bumper stickers on cars around here that are expressing memory and sympathy for the victims of a mass shooting perpetrated by a guy who was an Iraq War veteran who came back and was really, really fucked up and went into a bar on college night because he wanted to kill college kids. And he killed, I think, 12 or 13 of them before I think he killed himself when the cops came in. Either way, that incident really put a stain on my first year back in California after having lived in New York for so many years. We came back to the Thomas fire and the Borderline shooting. And I remember my wife and I talking a lot about, what did we come back to in California? It just seems like ground zero of a particular kind of nexus of climate change blowback, military and war blowback, and something in the vibes of Donald Trump being president. And I don't know what that is. I wonder if you guys feel that too. It feels like, the same American thing, which is what I'm thinking about with credit cards and student loan debt, and still, just renting a house and not owning a house at my age. and not knowing what my future career is going to be at my age is like this notion that you're just on your own. And there's something awful about that. I know that the sort of like Instagram, TikTok vibe is very much like bootstrappy right now. And I mean that on like left and right. There's a sense of like, you got to like go to the gym and get your shit together and not listen to other people's criticisms. And I see a lot of that stuff. Maybe that's just my algorithm. But to me, I saw this, I see this guy, Professor, I think his name is Scott Galloway. Do you guys see Professor Galloway? He's sort of a like liberal or maybe leftish influencer on the lines of like a Jordan Peterson. And he does a lot of these videos where he talks about how you should not listen to critics and you should do your own thing and you need to be able to withstand failure. And I just saw one the other night where he was like talking about, oh, well, 1 in 7 businesses fail. So I started 9 businesses and one of them hit. And if I didn't have the ability and the strength within me to overcome those failures, then I would have just lost, and been one of the many losers in America. So in other words, he's saying that in order to be successful and navigate a capitalism that is inherently unfair, you have to be able to get over failure, get over grief, get over depression. And when I hear that, I'm sort of like, okay, yeah, I get that. I get it on a practical level. You can't feel sorry for yourself all the time. That's not going to get you anywhere. But on the other part of it, it's kind of like, well, not everyone can do that. Let's actually, American life can be so pulverizing that not every person has the inner strength to just be like, I'm going to overcome feelings of failure. I'm going to overcome the grief that I feel from dead loved ones or ex-girlfriends and boyfriends or the heartache I feel about not making it in life. It's very easy for a guy like Galloway, who is, as I understand, like a millionaire or billionaire, to be able to just be like, well, just get over it. And you need to be able to, get over feeling bad for yourself. In my life, I have many times had to struggle with getting over feeling bad about myself. I'm trying to do that actually right now, I think, this very morning on this microphone, is try to sort of, swim through waters that are rushing at me at a particular speed. And it's hard. It's not easy. There are bits of me that want to just sort of give up and feel sorry for myself. And I know that this is like the time of year that a lot of people are feeling that way. So I guess I'm just reaching out to Nostalgia Trap listeners and saying, I'm with you in feeling that it's not always easy to just get over it. And I look at these guys that did this violence in New Orleans and in Las Vegas, and particularly the Las Vegas guy who, I guess, texted his ex-girlfriend and said he loved being in that rented Tesla Cybertruck because it made him feel like, quote, Batman or Halo. There's something really funny and pathological about that, but I also just find that really, really, really sad. The idea that like some dude is just kind of latching onto a bit of very masculine charged technology like the Tesla Cybertruck to feel like a character from pop culture, so that you could feel like not like the loser that you really are. And that his life ended in a pathetic suicide in front of Trump's tower is just even more sickening, and I think a harbinger of perhaps what we have in store for us over the next couple years. So, it's hard also not to be nostalgic at times like this and think back to the 90s, and that's what this episode is going to be about, the 1990s, the analog days, the last moment when we sort of had a grip on a different kind of technology and bad things didn't happen. I think the worst thing that happened in the 90s was maybe, some U.S. Army veteran loading up a moving truck with hundreds of pounds of fertilizer bomb and, blowing it up in front of a federal building and killing hundreds of people. That was the worst thing that happened. But other than that, everything was fine, and that's the nostalgia trap too. We're talking with David Humphries today. Who is David Humphries, and what are we going to talk about? David Humphries is a professor of English at the City University of New York. He is a CUNY Graduate Center fellow alumnus. So he's at Queensborough Community College teaching English there. He's a good friend of Justin Rogers Cooper, who is my frequent co-host and good friend here. By the way, Justin and I will be back next week to do some News Trap conversation and talk, I think, inevitably about the second Trump term and electric trucks and violence and things like that. But I'm talking with David Humphries today about a project that the two of them helped shepherd and put out into the world. And it's something that I think that Nostalgia Trap listeners will especially appreciate. This is kind of like an ebook. It's free. I will put the link in the episode description so you can check it out. It's called Happy Nostalgia: Making Connections with the Music of the 90s. And it's a series of essays by, I think, mostly scholars at the CUNY Graduate Center who are talking about music in the 90s, obviously, but also trying to figure out sort of what that particular musical moment was like and what it might mean to us as the last moment before streaming music took over, when there was a kind of different engagement with what music fanhood could be. I had a really fun conversation with him, and I want to read a quick bit from the introduction, which is written by David Humphries and Justin Rogers Cooper. This gets you a little flavor of where we go in this episode. So here's a little bit from Happy Nostalgia. While each day we mediate between analog and digital states, digital hegemony is the rule, the dominant form of extraction, the point of investment, the apex of surveillance. We know the many reasons why the digital became paradigmatic. Its convenience, ease, and intelligence sustain awesome effects of power for individuals and for corporations and for states. Take just one app on the cell phone, a pocket computer whose secondary functions relate to calling. The U.S. Defense Department developed GPS during the Cold War, with the first satellite launched in 1960. The agency spent billions making the classified system, but when the last satellites came online in 1995, the Cold War was already over. By 2000, the now unclassified system was available to anyone. Now we all carry the full power of this massive military project in our pockets. Now combine the photos, videos, social networks, banking, crypto, movies, shows, music, games, messages, news, reviews, notifications, live streams, sharing, Zooms, FaceTimes, posting, locking, passwords, swiping, liking, hearting, hacking, suspensions, terminations, stalking, blocking, bullying, canceling, conspiracies, recruitment, incels, chans, grifters, doxing, phishing, spamming, doom scrolling. As a technology of mass power, the cell phone rivals the automobile and firearm, a liberatory device of control, surveillance, anxiety, manipulation, deception, fantasy, secrets, and influence, of love, dating, marriage, and divorce, suicide, and murder. So that's a great little bit from the introduction to Happy Nostalgia. Again, the link is in the episode description. I urge you to check it out and read these essays. I know that Justin and I will do a future episode about his essay, which is specifically about Blind Melon and the lead singer Shannon Hoon, a band that many of you might not even know of or have heard of. They had one big hit in the 90s, but Justin's essay gets into why Blind Melon deserves our attention today, and we'll be talking about that in a future episode, so stay tuned. But it's hard not to read that passage and think about this guy in a rented Tesla Cybertruck typing in Las Vegas into the GPS and apparently going to Las Vegas, New Mexico, the wrong Las Vegas, and having to turn around and drive his truck all the way through the desert to get to the real Las Vegas. And in that short trip, he had to stop to charge his Cybertruck 8 times. All of this feeling like Batman on the way to go commit suicide in front of a Trump hotel. All of that feels like it's ripe for analysis and for, honestly, research and thought. And that's what we do here on Nostalgia Trap, and we will be doing much more of it. The title of this episode with David Humphries is love means research. And he explains what he means by that. And I felt like it's something that resonated very deeply with me while we were talking. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I want to thank David Humphries for coming on the show and for sharing his thoughts and ideas with us. So without further ado, here is my conversation with David Humphries. Okay, David Humphries, great to see you. Thank you for joining me on Nostalgia Trap.
It's great to be here. I'm pretty excited. First I have to honor your service because it's pretty awesome. I know when I did some book reviews of like academic presses, whether it was ethically appropriate or not, occasionally an author would say, "Thank you for reading my book and getting a review out there." So I really like that aspect of your podcast. I mean, it's really a great service to like the academy, and I'm sure a lot of the authors who are on academic, UPs are happy to have that. And then, I mean, when our mutual friend Justin Rogers Cooper put us in contact, I mean, we got nostalgia, and is it
Yeah.
happy, or are we going to fall into a trap? I guess that will be one of the questions we can
Well,
talk through.
yeah. Let's name the text we're talking about, and I want to.
Yes,
I'll put a link in this episode description so everyone who's listening can go check this out. It's called Happy Nostalgia, and I guess you might call it an ebook, a collection of essays by scholars all about. I don't know what you would call analog culture, looking back on the 90s. How would you describe this project? Because it
I
seems
would
like it
call
falls
it
in
all
line
of
with what
those
we're doing.
things. Yeah, I would call it all those things. I mean, I wanted to make sure because of course, like any academic, I could talk about my own ideas. I mean, I used to teach 4 hour once a week undergrad classes, so there's always a danger of rambling. But um, maybe just to think a little bit about sort of the actual format of the book. Yes, it's very much a labor of love. I'm a horrible, horrible sales person, and my experience as a student in restaurants and retail and as a bank teller would bear that out. But when I really like something, I find it kind of easy to promote. And so this book is for friends, faculty, and students of the liberal studies program of a master's program at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I was kind of thinking about that as just sort of like a grounding because a lot of this is analog versus digital. And, long before we had cyber trucks, we had cyberspace. And where are we exactly? So this was kind of very much grounded. And I don't want to go in the Wayback Machine, but, my dissertation, I did have the opportunity to turn into a book about journalism and how authors use figures of journalists to represent the culture of the 1920s. And so for me, this project was kind of like, 2020s versus the 1920s. And, one of my chapters that I'm probably most proud of was on Sherwood Anderson's book, Winesburg, Ohio, and as a cub reporter. And it's about a small town. And I grew up in a small suburb of Youngstown, Ohio called Girard. You're dealing with someone very famous here because my friend Scott and I won the eighth grade science fair and made the front page of the Girard News. But, I mean, there's been a lot about, I'm kind of approaching this from a tangent. Thanks for bearing with me. But there's been a lot about like small town papers disappearing and things. And so one of the things I really wanted to do was I wanted to make a project that was housed at the Graduate Center that was for a community kind of coming out of the pandemic where we weren't seeing each other. We weren't talking because we had all been holed up. I mean, I was sitting right where I am talking to you for 2 years, at my home desk. And so it's an ebook that's hosted on this platform called Manifold, which is I think it grew out of one of our colleagues at the Graduate Center, Matt Gold's work with the debates in the digital humanities. So it's an online platform that allows annotations. It looks good. It's easy to share. And it gave it a little bit of an imprimatur of like an official thing, even though I was the main editor and it's not a peer-reviewed journal. I would put under the rubric of public scholarship. And kind of getting back to your original question, like, and my salesmanship or salespersonship of this is it has a lot of students, and I'm really happy to kind of like get their ideas out there. And it's not just it definitely, and I mean, I also was really pleased to have some like really, outstanding research and scholars, full professors, associate professors, assistant professors, but also students who are part of this community that's loosely based around the liberal studies program. So it's an online ebook. It's a labor of love. And, I was looking, it's kind of weird doing it online because you get data. And I was looking, a lot of the professors are getting more reads, myself included. So I'm kind of really excited to be here to make sure people realize like there's some really exciting stuff by current PhD or master's students at the grad center.
And it seems like
Um,
music is the theme of this thing, right?
I should have said that in the lead, absolutely. So when it comes to pop culture, that's kind of my sweet spot. And, um, I come from an area of the country where like football and sports are king, especially football, a little bit boxing. But if some people their high school sports careers are like the pinnacle of achievement, I have to say, and I'm not criticizing, I'm about to say, I put a lot of emphasis on my 3 years of being a college DJ from 1990 to 1993. So it just was a way I kind of found my way into a college that was not my first choice necessarily, and where it was a little hard to make friends and kind of find a niche. I went to John Carroll in Cleveland, and I know you've talked a lot about sort of there's a little bit of a critical university studies component to sort of my piece in there, so
Yeah.
I found myself in a place where I was not feeling very at home, and being a college DJ was sort of where the cool, weird people were. And so a lot of those relationships with people, as well as with the music, as well as with this analog period, were kind of imprinted on me as, like a very key experience. That said, a lot of the contributors were maybe not born at that time, or their experience of the 1990s, and for that matter, analog music, is in retrospect. So that created kind of a nice tension, those of us who were there and those of us who are remembering.
Yeah, when I first thought of, and this, I think this is what will get us started thinking about sort of nostalgia, because just you mentioning college radio in the 90s. I was never a part of the college radio scene besides listening to it, but I had a friend at UC Santa Barbara who was a DJ on the college radio. I was so jealous of his whole experience, and I think I'm still trying to catch up to that by talking into a microphone on a podcast, because I just and I honestly wish I was spinning music. I mean, part of me is just like, why am I not doing that? How do you do that? But that whole world, it's funny you mentioned people who are younger and don't remember the 90s but have a kind of weird nostalgia for it. This is the trap for me, and this is why partly what I was thinking when I first thought of the term nostalgia trap for this podcast was the idea that, I always grew up listening to older people talk about how the good old days of their youth. And I thought it was such a distorting lens to think about that, yet the best times were just happened to be when you were young. But I was to put a little autobiographical stamp on this. The 90s were when I was 11 years old when the 90s started and 21 when they ended. So it was just like an enormous period of youth and growth in that. I mean, from 11 to 21, I don't know if there's more growth that you will ever do in your life. And it was during the 90s. And so I have this sort of distorted lens in it. But at the same time, the 90s were a unique period in terms
Mhm.
of it feels like, and I wonder what your take on this is, but it feels like the last moment of a certain kind of relationship to pop culture, what you describe as like the sort of analog thing of mixtapes and mix CDs and having a kind of, it's the pre-digital, pre-streaming era. So in other
A
words,
hundred
all of
percent.
that nostalgia for me is mixed up with a feeling of kind of, well, maybe it was a unique era. Maybe I'm not distorting it. Maybe
Yeah.
actually the 90s were the best time to be alive. And it's so funny that the last thing I'll throw in is how you mentioned in your introduction to this book the sort of like idea that so many young people are longing for the 90s,
Hmm.
and are kind of into 90s culture, and also like getting into collecting vinyl, cassette
Hmm.
tapes.
Yeah, mixtapes are making a comeback for sure.
Yeah, so I'm happy that you guys are sort of playing with the ideas in that world, because it's something that I've thought a lot about too.
Yeah, I mean, I want to make sure I give all the credit in the world to those who helped. So our mutual friend Justin Rogers Cooper, I really started from a position of experience and went looking for theories, and they were there. So I'm going to be able to corroborate some of what you said. Maybe it wasn't just we were young once, and I think I could add probably +8 or +9 to your age, which does really matter. I think in terms of the music that imprints on you,
Definitely,
because
yeah.
we can talk more about that. But Justin Rogers Cooper did a great job kind of stepping into a half finished introduction and adding a lot of the theory to it. I've been working, and to kind of get to your point, I do think there is something different. And I mean, I think I'll start with one citation, because one of the first texts I went to that I had fake read, meaning grad school read, I heard about was Simon Reynolds' Retromania. So that was the first thing I actually read cover to cover. And, we could definitely get, and I think we have to get into the analog versus digital versus streaming. But, one of the things he points out is maybe it really was a high point of community building. And he's, had sort of the punk, post-punk UK perspective on rave culture. And so he kind of, in that book, I'm grossly simplifying, but, one of the ideas is sort of like the 90s was EDM and rave culture was the last new genre that created a whole lifestyle around it.
Mm.
And at the same time, between Nirvana and I guess I'll just mention things I like. I was kind of more of a Public Enemy, Digable Planets sort of guy, but I think everybody listened. Like when I moved to New York in 1996, everyone in the world seemed to be listening like the Fugees. So you kind of had also this like hip hop was not trying to get on MTV or on the radio. It's on the radio, it's on MTV. Rock actually seemed like, Nirvana took alternative heavy metal and punk and made this, new genre. So rock music had, I definitely wore a lot more flannel in those years. So it just seemed like there was this sense, not only with the technology, but the actual communities that grew up around it. And they were very vibrant, and I think there's a lot we could say that's better now because I think a lot of people were more genre bound and like Metallica would get into the alternative music, but maybe not AC/DC meant you were like a stoner and not an alternative kid or so. So it's kind of weird how people police these things. I actually liked Arrested Development, and they made a new album a couple of years ago, like kind of talking about how like alternative, white people embraced them, and it kind of discredited their like bona fides as like hip hop artists, but because people were kind of policing those boundaries. So there were definitely some downsides to this idea, but I think there is something about you got a community with your music.
Mm.
It wasn't a digital experience. You had to go to record stores, you had to go to shows, you had to go to clubs. If you were in, we have some really good writing on hip hop. If you were a crate digger, you had to go to the vinyl used stores and thrift stores to pick up old vinyl to try to find your samples and things. So like, I think the analog, along with this idea of like, it was the last, those genres had limits and there's a lot going on there with geography and race and class and all those things. But I think there was something to that. You had to leave your house, you had to do
Yeah.
research.
Well, that's
Um,
part of it's part of why I got into writing about coffee houses for my dissertation at the
mhm.
graduate center
Yeah.
because I was interested in those spaces and like the 90s coffee house scene was a very particular thing. But like it's funny because like now you're talking about like younger people who are sort of trying to grab that world and part of it I think is also the pandemic like they're trying to like find the real world again.
Hmm.
It feels very self-conscious whereas in the 90s as much as there was a kind of I don't know, yeah, policing about scenes. It also felt like you just had to, you literally had to go to these places
You
to
had to
find
go.
them. Like you had to go to the record store to buy things. I wasn't even aware of like how deep that went until I saw, I think that it was a hip hop documentary on Netflix that showed this like the like a nutrition like health store in LA, health food store. I
Hmm.
forget the name of it, but it became this scene where like a lot of the rappers were going to like basically try out new stuff and try out new styles.
Hmm.
And the sort of like video clips and footage that they have of that stuff is incredible because it's like there's so many people there. And it's clear that it's not just like a self-conscious, like, oh, let's go, listen to some poetry. It more feels like we have to do this because there's no other place to
Yeah.
find like new music.
Well, I think that's where you get into I use the word self-conscious. I think that's really important because one of my unique features, and I appreciate, you calling attention to this throughout your podcast, is the hierarchy and the dysfunction of higher ed. So, my primary job's at a community college. I just taught two English 101 classes, and for some English professor, that's like saying, the horror, by the way, maybe don't teach, Heart of Darkness anymore. But I mean, I first taught English 101 in 1994 at Ohio State. So it was my 30th year. Not every year did I teach English 101, full disclosure, but I'm also dealing with master's students and helping people go to some pretty good PhD programs. So I'm very happy to make a living wage and have a retirement account and be in a union and all that. But it is funny going to like a conference or something and someone sees CC and like, oh, there's a kind of hierarchy, as you know, whether it's
Mhm.
adjunct labor versus tenure or community college versus research. So I mean, I have to make a necessity, a virtue out of that necessity, which is I'm dealing with students who are not, or it's open access, and I'm teaching 101. And the word self-conscious, because it's not that these things die, it's that instead of having, it's not wild anymore. It's cultured. I can get students to think about these things. Or in the book, one of my former students who's actually in a PhD program in media studies, Max Kaplan, talks about going to a concert now and trying to immerse themselves in a series of concerts that have a nostalgia component. You can't take away phones. You may never take your phone out there, but you're going to see. It's that idea of like, and I was trying to kind of think of some aphorisms in case I got too tired today. And one I was thinking is there's no present today.
Mhm.
My
Yeah.
son is um this may speak to genetics, and coolness being a genetics thing. He plays the tuba. So I went to this concert band last week, and not a normal venue for me. And I'm looking around at these teenagers, he's in high school, and it's almost obligatory to record it on my phone, which I did because my parents weren't there or whatever, ex grandparents. But I was amazed at how many people were watching the concert through their phone
Mm.
to get the perfect recording. So the photon, like the actual, they never actually saw their friend or their child on stage because they were looking at the same thing they looked at all day, their screen. They had the screen in front of their face. And it's like, that's kind of the moment we live in where we're recording a present that we're not even experiencing fully. And to me, that is part of the nostalgia of going back then, because as soon as you talked about your book on coffee houses, you're very good with titles, by the way. I think you should plug what your book was. What Common Grounds, I think.
Dangerous grounds. Yeah.
Dangerous Grounds, yes. Common Grounds with a coffee. Yes,
It's
Dangerous
got the
Grounds. Good.
dad joke in there about coffee
I love
grounds.
dad
Yeah.
jokes. Yes, it's good. But like when I was in, and I think geography played a lot in that. And again, you can imagine if you're a queer person, if you're a punk rocker in a small town, it could be very constraining, but it also forced you out of your comfort zone. So, being like a punk rocker type in high school and early in college, I'm an hour and 15 minutes away from Pittsburgh or Cleveland. You had to go drive there. I
Mm.
saw shows in Youngstown at punk venues, but like I want to buy import records. I want to find out who's playing. And so, like in Cleveland, there's a strip called Coventry. We pronounced it Arabic at the time. There was a local chain of coffee shops. And on the same street, there's a vegan restaurant. And then there was I think it's still there, the Record Revolution, where they sold bongs. My brother got an earring there, and they had all the import records. And it was kind of like comic book guy from The Simpsons. You'd like, do you have the new Cure European single CD? And they're like, oh, they're so mainstream or whatever. But you had to actually go there and like going to the coffee shop, going to the vegan restaurant, going to the like head shop, record store, and seeing the wall there, the billboard at the entrance with, do you want to, band looking for bass player, local, after party rock show, or there was a dance club called the Lift in the Flats in Cleveland. You might see like a DJ was coming, all in the same place. And like you said, it wasn't that you did it because you had to and you enjoyed it. So, I could get my students to turn their phones off or go to a concert or go to a bookstore and find a book that they want to buy or something like that. But it's always going to be culture now. You can never reverse that intermediary of technology. And I think that's part of the nostalgia that I'm kind of like, that's true nostalgia for me is I don't think that could be recreated.
Yeah, I know. And it can lead I think the easy path, and I think this is what's great about happy nostalgia is there's nothing easy about this, but like the easy path to thinking through this is often kind of like a Luddite kind of perspective that's just like,
Right.
tech ruined everything.
Right.
But to me, like when I'm thinking in that vein, I'm kind of thinking about like I'm lamenting, I don't know, the sort of like how it just must mean that looking at your phone is so desirable and so addictive that it somehow overcame all those other things, like all of that other world, and that world got subsumed to that in some way. And like the idea that you're talking about of like people looking at the video of their of the concert instead of like the person in front of them that's actually, I mean,
Yeah.
the whole reason you're going to this thing is to see in real life. I mean, I think it's you that shares a story of going to see Elliott Smith in Ohio. And I think
Yeah.
Justin has a great story. I think he's told on the podcast of seeing Elliott Smith as well, and actually waiting, in on the side of the bar that he was performing at, and talking with Elliott Smith for a few minutes after the performance. And that
Hmm.
to me is like, to me, I'm like, wow, that's like a God moment. That's like, a holy moment kind of thing. And if
It
he had
is.
like
Well,
just grabbed a selfie with him, it wouldn't have been quite the same.
would not.
And that, I think that's it's easy to think that way, but at
I,
the same time, there's an aura to it that has been lost, and that's disturbing.
well, I think we're having a brain meld because I was just about to say my guiding light personally was is Walter Benjamin. I was in grad school in the 90s, so everyone assigned Walter Benjamin, but you know what? It stuck with me. And when you said aura, that's really what I was getting at. And I think if you approach this from sort of a lefty political cultural studies lens, one of the questions I kind of would I don't have an answer for it, but I mean, one of my principles here was that a commodity can be more than a commodity, it could be an artifact, and that an artifact can imply communities and connections. And revolution might be too strong a word, but change. And I think that idea of like you have to go buy a record and you have to talk to someone and you have to get out of your comfort zone. And then that object had an aura to it. It had the place. It had the person who recommended to you. It had the feedback you got from your friends. And as you're saying with the concerts, I was trying to resist this, but I think you kind of already went there. It had a little bit of a sacred experience. I mean, I mentioned in the intro one experience and another in the chapter that I wrote, but um, when I was a student at Ohio State getting my master's, I had a lot of time. Partially I didn't have I wasn't in a serious relationship. I didn't have obligations to a child or to elder care or anything like that. But it's also just you're in a college town, like what are you going to do in Columbus, Ohio? Drink, drugs, watch football. There's a limited amount of or read and go to shows and things so I met this guy, Jason, and I took a language class for free. And I met this guy, Jason, who, had sleeve tattoos and was a drummer in a punk band. He lived in this communal house, which really I was not a part of in any way except as a guest. But they somehow knew all the skateboarders and punk bands and people who did traveled around in vans. And I saw a number of like bands who were on Discord Records, Fugazi's label and things. So he invited me to this one show, which is the cover for the book, which was Elliott Smith and this group, the Softies, two women from the Northwest. It's just in his house. So I mean, I
Yeah.
was just sitting there on the floor, like 50 or 75 or maybe 100 people in this big Victorian house. While Elliott Smith did a set, acoustic set, sitting on a sofa.
Wow.
Um, and it was all because I had to talk to people. It wasn't
Yeah.
an option, you know what I mean? Like I had to talk, like, hey, I'm a 25-year-old grad student. Here's a 22 or 23-year-old senior undergrad. He seems cool. Strike up a conversation. We both like alternative or whatever you want to call kind of music. It's that's what I mean. You could kind of trace the experience, but it does lend its kind of aura, to be there. And as I talked about in the intro, it's like a couple years later, here I am miles away in New York. And I'm like, he's on the Oscars. I just a couple of years ago was like sitting on a sofa with this guy. And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, I mean, writing nostalgia and kind of rethinking it. Um, I took a little mini vacation to Montreal and I was watching the Canadian news and the Chiron said Softies released their first album in 24 years. I don't know why that was huge news in Canada, but like that band, I actually remembered the Softies more than I did Elliott Smith.
Mm.
They were like it was a really chill show. They just was two mini sets that they did, the Softies and Elliott Smith, but it all has this history and you kind of go back and you think what could be, and that's where I was kind of into the Arcades project and Benjamin and my own writing, kind of thinking like what could be recovered from that experience of a group of, I think it was mostly guys, there might have been some queer guys in there, but definitely like a punk skater vibe, hosting shows in their house, promoting them by like making handmade flyers. And I don't know how they, I worked with a student who did Girl with the RRRRL, and fanzines, and there's a, and worked on archives. NYU has a nice archive. So there were these underground ways where, you had to like find someone who could Xerox or mimeograph 100 flyers or,
Yeah.
you knew a friend who worked at Kinko's or something like that. So
I was just
just
gonna say
energy.
Kinko's was like a scene when I was young. Like Kinko's was the place where all these punks would hang out and make their zines and make their flyers and that sort of thing. And the fact that younger people are longing for that to me means
Mhm.
that there must be something dead in the phone. There must be something. I don't know. I hate to pose it as like less than, but I guess I am at the risk of sounding like an old man. But there's something that you want that's more tactile, that's more meaty, that's more, I mean, it really literally has like human flesh attached to it. It's funny because you mentioned the Arcades project, and I haven't read that stuff in a long time, but like, part of what I feel Benjamin's project was sort of describing a culture of capitalism and a kind of like moment where you have this image of like the flaneur, which is I guess the consumer,
Right.
this pure subject of capitalism that's sort of walking through a space that's all storefronts and shops and restaurants and like just all stuff to buy. And it's funny because we had this discourse in the 90s about mall culture where we were kind of like, oh, the mall is gross, it's just like sick corporate shit. And I
Yes,
remember
definitely.
hating Blockbuster Video, hating Barnes and Noble, and just being like, these are just corporate versions of something real. But now I'm like, God, I wish we had Blockbuster and Barnes and Noble. And that's
Yeah,
kind of interesting. It means that it must mean something to us to like want to actually walk through these spaces.
absolutely. And you definitely, I mean, I also laugh because I remember those conversations and now I'll see I have a, not much on social media, but I have a Blue Sky account. You'll see people celebrating a Barnes and Noble opening. It's like,
Yes.
wow, I don't know. I mean, I still like an indie bookstore, but that's pretty interesting. And, what you're saying, I don't think we're going to solve, two Davids talking about uses of nostalgia will create a grand solution. But the idea you talk about it being self-conscious, because again, I'm have the opportunity and I would say privilege of working with grad students and having some, not much, but some support to write and do research, but I do have a pretty heavy teaching load depending on the semester. One of my friends at QCC, at Queensborough Community College, had the sound test. And she always told me if you can hear the students talking when you approach the classroom the first day, it's going to be a good class.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if some of them are troublemakers or whatever, because they have energy. And if they have energy, you are going to be able to direct energy and work with it. And, she retired during the pandemic. And one of the reasons she told me, she said, I'm not sure that'll ever happen again. Because when you have a phone with your mom, your best friend, your Instagram account, it's been years, probably since everyone got a smartphone, that any classes passed the sound check where I heard them before I got there. They're
Yeah.
all scared.
Yep.
They're all texting someone or looking at something on their phone. Now, I will say, because I don't want to be just a Luddite or totally that we're on a downward slope to oblivion. Like a lot of it was the pandemic. I saw that, but I think I mean, I really like the word you had, self-conscious, because I'm at a campus where uh, I had 46 students to start the term, and two were white, and neither of them finished the class. So I ended up, everyone was a person of color. A lot were immigrants. I feel good, and I'm not ashamed to say there's a little part of me that's an old school liberal where it's like, wow, people who would never talk to each other because they live in different neighborhoods. We're not far from Long Island. Some are living in the suburbs. They're communicating because of the way I structured the class and because they brought their bodies to the classroom, and
Mm.
I'm trying to engage them and make them excited about learning. It's that part that I wonder if it's always going to be self-conscious and cultivated. It's kind of like, is there a wilderness out there that we're like untamed and maybe a little scary but exciting, or is it all going to be gardens at this point where we have to say, hey, turn your phone off, go to the library together with your partner and find an article and bring it back and present it to the class, and then they come back and now they're talking, it's great and stuff, but I don't know how to sustain that because it just may not be possible. The phone is just too much of a pacifier and a crutch.
Yeah, it's the default, right? It's like,
The
yeah, we'll
default.
we'll, we'll go and, experience something organic and in meat space for a while. But when it's over, we're all gonna drop back onto our phones. I mean, you see it everywhere, and I think it's very easy to locate it as something that young people are doing, but I mean, it's everybody. I mean, I just
Everybody.
everybody, and that's what's I think disturbing about it is just recognizing. like what is it about that? And like I don't know. I think I did an episode a while ago thinking about Benjamin's Arcades project as like the arcade is on the phone now because it's just sort of like this endless scroll
Hmm.
reproduces the kind of walking through a mall, but like in a faster sort of way. And
That's a great
that's
point.
yeah, that's why it's sort of
It's
like, yeah, like what has this done to us?
and there's no contemplation, I mean, it's certainly I'm not I mean, I think that's part of having a couple different generations here. I don't think we had any boomers. We had some older Gen Xers like myself, a lot of millennials in this project. And I mean, I recognize the irony because, of course, it's an ebook, and part of
Yeah.
the benefit. There's so many benefits. So I don't think it's never going. We don't want to
And
just say we're
we're
all
podcasting right now
your podcast. Yeah,
on Zoom about an ebook that I'm going to put this stuff on like Instagram and stuff like that. So yeah.
exactly,
Yep.
exactly. So right, the ironies are abound. And like for example, like we don't really know academia, as you know, is very slow moving. So I had like done a period where I was chair of my department, a very turbulent period. I was fortunate. I hired 28 tenure track faculty lines during my 6 years as chair. I was the chair of the
Wow.
search. So that was an amazing period, but a lot of that's unraveling because of where we are in the humanities enrollment. But my point is, I published an article last year, which was also kind of critical university studies and in writing on the Edge journal, which I was really excited about because I had a Maxine Hong Kingston quote that was from that journal. So I thought, you know what, I had some interest in like a trade publication. I'm like, I really want to put it there. But when I got the contract, it said, you can only share it individually through email. So I have a PDF, and if you're lucky enough to have a library subscription, it's indexed in some
Yeah.
major, search engine. So you'll find it if you're a professor or a student, but I can't tweet it out. I can't put it on my home site. And so, yes, the ironies abound. You are doing a great service here. You can be your own editor. I was my own editor with some help from Justin and a few of the students on this project. And the amazing thing is the minute it hits, and with, thank you for your help today in promoting a bit more, everyone can read it. And that's awesome. I think so. I'm certainly not for putting up barricades and reimagining that we're going to go back to this world of deep editors and elitism and Luddites and everything has to be on paper and all that. It'll never happen in any way. But um,
It's interesting though that
there,
there's a nostalgia even for an earlier moment of digital life. The kind of idea of like I don't know if you're remembering Napster and LimeWire, and
100%.
there was still like a crate digging an exploration sort of element to it.
Hmm.
I think that as we've progressed into like social media and streaming, it's changed, but to sort of put like yeah, kind of positive spin on some of this stuff, and I wonder what you think about this is like I I was always into Neil Young as an example, but I only had like one Neil Young CD that was like the best of. And I always knew that
Hmm.
there was this huge catalog of Neil Young albums, but I didn't have the money to
Yeah.
buy them and I couldn't really get them. And I wasn't going to spend like $20 on a Neil Young album that was like it was a risk. I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to like it. And so it wasn't until maybe streaming music that I was able to like plunge into his back catalog and discover all of these albums and like really become a much more sort of like Neil Young head through
Absolutely.
streaming. So, and I know a lot of people feel that way, that like streaming allowed me to, because I don't know if you remember, of course you remember, like when listening stations started appearing at like Virgin Records and Tower Records and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It was like a godsend to be able to listen to something
Yeah.
before you purchased it because I can tell you that like my parents were just constantly on me all the time through college. When I was like asking them for money, they would say, "Well, how many CDs did you buy this week?" Because I would spend so much of my money. I mean, they were $15 a piece at
Yeah.
least,
It
right?
was.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I guilty as charged. I mean, I talk a little bit about finding this amazing artist who sadly passed too young, Jenny May, who was in Columbus. I found that out through a Spotify algorithm, and
Right.
I reconstructed sort of the human connection that I may or may not have. Like, did I actually see her? I talked to my friends, who were there in Columbus when I lived in there. And I mean, as recently as like, an hour ago, my news feed brought up a Johnny Marr, guitarist from the Smiths. I learned his real name was Johnny Maher, Maher, and he started talking about his favorite Stooges album was Raw Power, that it influenced his guitar playing. I don't own that one. And full
Mm-hmm.
disclosure, once I filled my hard drive, my external hard drive with, I don't know, 15,000 MP3s, I've been where I'm sitting right now for 10 years. But I mean, I lived in half a dozen New York apartments. I can't carry around, I don't know how many, 500 CDs or album. It's not possible. So at one point I burned everything to a hard drive. It's full. I'm streaming, and I have friends who guilt me all the time, go on Bandcamp, and it's like, I'm not going to buy another hard drive to carry around with, and it's so I'm totally with you. And like, so I read this Johnny Mark, I'm like, oh, you know what? I don't think I ever really listened to Raw Power by the Stooges. I do partially because I have my hearing's a little bit damaged from all those punk shows, but I do have decent headphones, so I have Apple Music. I'd like to say it's because I don't like Joe Rogan or something, but I do have Spotify and Apple Music because I like the quality on Spotify and the interface on Spotify. The quality on Apple Music is sometimes better. So, like to your point, I didn't go out and spend $20 on a Stooges album from 1974, but I really enjoyed it. I listened to it this morning a couple times because and the algorithm was what fed me the article. It obviously
Mm-hmm.
figured out I like the Smiths and Johnny Marr. Johnny Marr, yeah, if he says it's his favorite album, I'm going to listen to it. And I didn't have, so no one's going to unravel that piece. But I kind of getting back to being an English 101 teacher and, the idea of sort of self-conscious and like cultivating versus self-directed. What you and I are talking about, anyone over 40 or so. And by the way, I did see the same thing in my newsfeed today. I saw that there's a book called Mood Machine out today about Spotify. So, a lot of these things are and kind of talking about just what we're talking about, like the rise of Spotify and how do we go back from algorithms and our year and wrapped up and all that. But part of it, I think, is one of my other aphorisms was when I was growing up, love meant research. And I teach English 101. Love does not mean research. And
Right.
I don't know if you're still teaching, if what you experienced, but a good example, and I mentioned my one of my high school friends, John. If you lived in somewhere kind of not really the middle of nowhere, but certainly not a metropolis, Youngstown's kind of a mini city. I pretty much had classic rock, top 40. I'm a Gen Xer, so you got MTV in 120 minutes. You have to stay up, it's in real time. You got to stay up late and watch 120 minutes. And then my friend had an older brother who was a college DJ at Kent State. So anything he told me to listen to, I listened to, and I could attach it. So I remember him right after New Order Substance came out, 1987. He gave me a copy to listen to, and I taped it. I loved it. And I remember asking him, like, what is this, like death disco? It's like beats with suicide or something. I knew nothing about the band. I wasn't so far off with that. But so I spent my $20 to go and buy a double CD. And, this was a band who cultivated enigma and being, mysterious. So it just says substance on it. I open it up and there's very little in the liner notes. And I see two of the songs say Joy Division, Ceremony and In a Lonely Place. I've heard of Joy Division. I don't know what Joy Division is. I don't know why they're in the liner
Oh,
notes for
wow.
New
Yeah.
Order. There's
Yeah.
no Google, and I remember there's a guy, Sean, who was a friend of mine later from these punk shows. He had this, like, it was a subculture, definitely, because my high school, but he had this jean jacket that had Joy Division Disorder. I think it was from the single. So it had like a man with a face with hands coming out where the eyes would be. And so, like, I'm like, do I want to ask this guy who's a year younger than me what's Joy Division and look not cool? Like, how am I going to find out what the hell Joy Division is and why they would be in a liner note? So, I subscribed to Rolling Stone. I would buy Vibe or Spin magazine. Sometimes I would go to these record stores. So, what I see now is students will come up with, I have this assignment I'm trying to write about called American Icons, and I let them pick someone they think is iconic. And this semester was great. I had like civil rights leaders and like Ruby Shields and Bob Ross, the painter, and things. But students don't naturally, like a few years ago, if you were into skateboarding or you were into manga comics or something, or you just were into comic books and said, well, read a book on Stan Lee, you would do it. You know what I mean? You were excited. If you had a topic you're excited about, where now I think one of the things I worry about is sort of the shallowness of the research and the loss of book culture.
Yes.
So students
Yes.
will like these are great. I would have never, if I had assigned topics, I never would have come up with their topics. I would have probably come up with Muhammad Ali, Marilyn Monroe, Michael Jackson, because those are always the most popular American icons. I could probably speculate on why, but like the students came up with cool topics, but to get them to understand like what it would mean to read a biography of this person or to go to the library or to and I try to build that in, but again, it gets back to this time we're living in. I do think that's where this nostalgia is like a feeling of nostalgia and then how to make it useful because it is sort of cultivating something. It's not organic to just tell the student, like, you know what, have fun. This is college. Be self-directed. You're into skateboarding. Find out how that started. Find out, what happened when Vans started sponsoring it or whatever. The students just want to do a Google search or even worse, an AI search, and they feel like they've learned something where there's that passion of like, wow, I want to know what the hell New Order is. Like, there's no picture on this CD. Like, what do
It's
they
too
look
it's
like? Where did
it's
they?
too easy, and you don't remember that kind of research, like this sort of like Googling something. I'm never going to have a memory attached to the one time I Googled something. I'll give you an example because as you're talking, like I love the idea of love means research because I was in the film studies department at UC Santa Barbara in the 90s. And it was, discovering cinema was its own thing. And you had to actually go down to LA to see independent films. And you had to go talk to the weird ponytail guy at the video store and have him show you who Werner Herzog is and like all that sort
Mhm.
of thing. But we were supposed to do a research project for one of my classes, and my professor just, I was sort of like lost. What should I research? And she gave me the idea. She's like, you know what I want you to do? She's like, I want you to find out about this movie, The Long Goodbye, with the Robert Altman film
Mhm.
starring Elliot Gould. That's a noir detective movie. She's like, I want you to find out about that and find out about how it was marketed and why it failed as a film because it was a kind of had a cult following. So what I had to do was literally I drove down to LA and went to an archive and found this stuff like on microfiche, literally, um, of the whole kind of production history of this film. And I had never seen it before. I had to actually find a copy somewhere. And my memories of researching that film are some of the like richest memories of my college time. It's like I will
Mhm.
always remember researching The Long Goodbye, spending a few days pouring through archives, finding this stuff, making photocopies of it, and writing that paper. And like now, if I were told to find out about The Long Goodbye, I would literally just find a YouTube video where someone just explains what it is to me. And like, they're like, this is what it is, and
Yeah.
that's that. And it's sort of, I wouldn't have the work attached to it. I think that's really interesting. That like the work element of it. I like of that, like, love means research because there's something to that. It also makes me think of like, I don't know if you remember like when you got a CD, like when I got a new CD, it was like a prize object. You talk about aura. But one of the things that I did always was like, it's time when I got a new CD, it's like it's time to sit down with the headphones by myself and listen to the whole thing in order as if it were a movie and read the lyrics on the liner notes alongside, listening to it. And that experience is something I don't do anymore either. And brings to mind that whole like love means research thing because the work of it is partly what created the nostalgic memory, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of moving in the direction of, it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that, which is probably where we have to be. But I know what you mean. I mean, when I think of at Ohio State for my master's, it was an exam based, not a thesis based. So I would go to the library and rotate to two different coffee shops and read for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And when I got my PhD at the Graduate Center, I joined Bope's library because I didn't know anyone at NYU and I didn't have a Wi-Fi connection. So I had to use like the same computers the undergrad used. I would just say, I'm not going to check my email for 3 hours.
I love Bobst.
And,
A lot of nostalgic
and
memories at Bobst.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's one of those things where when you're inside, it's the best place to be because a lot of people, think it marred Washington Square Park, but it's a great view of Washington Square Park and very pleasant. So, like I can't read for more than 20 minutes to a half hour
Yeah.
without checking my
Oh,
phone.
me neither.
So it's impossible. So that's probably not going to come back. But the point I think is I'm going to have a hard time giving up book culture. And it's a very popular topic and it's real. that whether it's at Harvard or Queensborough Community College, have been articles. I just saw one about Harvard last week that students aren't reading whole books. There's something about, and this is where I kind of think, well, I'm okay being an elder statesman here. I grew up in a town that was like in a economic free fall that was primarily a football, blue collar, steel town. My friends and I mean, some of the smartest people I'm sure I'll ever meet, we know how to entertain ourselves and we understood their times. I mean, it's a Catholic school. We had to go to church like on holy day. Like you're going to be bored. So your mind is going to create things that are pranks and daydreams and plans and well, you're full of hormones or other thoughts going on. But the idea of like sometimes you're bored and that's actually a launching pad for creativity and deep thought.
Yeah.
It's very hard. We were talking before we started, the bands that imprinted on me and music, and I actually think music's in a much better place than it was in the late 90s. So I'm kind of more of an early to mid 90s kind of
Hmm.
guy. But I kind of grew up with like post-punk. That friend I mentioned, he gave me my first Elvis Costello album, The Clash, New Order. My high school was the Fighting Irish, so not surprisingly, the alternative crowd was into early U2, and early like you had that great show on REM, early REM, and
Hmm.
um, so I never really like got totally into grunge, but I like 10 came out, Nirvana, Siamese Street, I like all that stuff, but I just laugh when you think about like kind of we would parse Kurt Cobain's lyrics and the idea like we're here now, entertain us. When I'm trying to explain to students, a lot of them can't watch a documentary. And I will say it's a little better than it was during the pandemic, but like they were yelling at my generation about watching too much television. So when you're into YouTube and TikTok videos, the idea of like building your attention span and understanding that like it's okay to be bored, that you're not going to be entertained all the time. And that's actually when you think about, well, if I'm not entertained, what would I want to be thinking about? What would
Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
do? What would I don't know that that's coming back, but I think as you expressed it, there is a real longing. And I did feel the AI and the reading were real struggles with my 101 classes, but I was impressed how much the students connected. And I was happy that I had components of the class that got them to interact. But, and as you're describing your music, your research on that Altman film, a lot of it is I'm making students interview people.
Nice. Yeah,
And
that's good.
I definitely am getting a little, when I was at Ohio State, Douglas Copeland came to promote, his Gen X book. So I've always been you know, I'm what for better or worse, I'm a Gen Xer, but I remember reading something recently just talking about landlines and like how afraid kids are of everything and blocking calls. And like you literally pick the phone up, you don't know who's calling. It could
Yeah.
literally be your dad's boss and say, is Tom Humphries there? This is so and so from the phone company. And like you had to know how to like be polite because it could be your dad,
Yeah.
or it could be, like you had no idea. So there was all these. I guess what I'm saying is I think two things that are operative are it's okay to be bored and it's you have to be uncomfortable at times to grow. And it could be the guy with the ponytail and the bad attitude telling you like, why are you buying a Cure record? You should check out. Let me think of a Cleveland band. My Dad Is Dead. Don't listen to Cure. Listen to My Dad Is Dead. They're similar, but they're way better.
Now I'm gonna look
Okay,
that up
so
on
I got
streaming.
the
Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty good. I recommend chopping down the family tree. My Dad Is Dead.
Nice.
Um, but you had to be a little outside your comfort zone. And I don't know that you can recreate that, but I do think what you said, there's a longing for it. And that's where I did kind of see, and some of the students, I think one of my favorite pieces is Addie Malinowski's on Arthur Russell, because I realized I had listened to Arthur Russell's songs and I was looking like, wait, I know this person, but I had no idea how eclectic and talented, and he was one of those, people who died too young during the AIDS epidemic. And that's what I'm talking about making connections. And some of it is an algorithm had recommended Olivia Liang's To the River. So I talked to actually one of the contributors, Max Kaplan, about another book of hers, Lonely City, and I just read it last week. And she has different artists around New York around that time, Andy Warhol and others. And I'm seeing Arthur Russell's name and I'm making a connection with someone I met by making this ebook. So I do think there is a way where bringing together the opportunities like your podcast, like the ebook, that are purely digital, but they're creating conversations. But I do think
Yeah. Yeah.
hopefully our AI overlords won't use the word meat space with too much, vitriol. But I do think like meat space is important, that the students seeing guys dapping each other and, students sharing phone numbers and working on projects together. I do think, I don't want to generalize too much from the pandemic, but I do think there is this energy and definitely music. I mean, love is research. I think when you used the word aura earlier, I don't know how you get back I don't know that I mean it may just be a privilege that we existed before phones, but there
Yes,
is
I
an
think it
aura of
is.
seeing
Yeah.
someone, seeing someone live. Um, it's just a different experience. And I do think that's where I kind of I consider myself a little bit, if I'm a lefty and I'm looking at commodities, I think I'm a little bit of a romantic and a mystic in that sense, because I do think being in the same space, being immersed in the same experience, it gives you a completely different feeling. Just like you described, you're always going to remember driving down to LA and who you had to talk to and the things you traced. I don't know if you could recreate that, but clearly people are not spending a lot. Maybe they are spending a lot of money to go and, take a photo that they were at this Taylor Swift show or something. But when you're in a space, and I mean, I think that's why music is so perfect. We also have someone who did something on MC Hammer and dance. But, we think of music, it reminds you of time passing. I mean, I went to a Jesuit college. I had to read Aristotle and all, and a lot of 19th century British folks and Matthew Arnold and all that. Like, I mean, time music is so abstract, when you're and that's why it's so weird to like watch a whole concert through your phone while you're recording it, because it's disappearing while you're hearing it.
Mm.
You don't have to know, you don't have to know context. Like it's so immediate and powerful. Sound waves are hitting your body. They're going in your ears. It's so physical, but it definitely calls to mind the passage of time. And, I do think there's something about this moment we're living in where we're stretching for this post-human. I think there's a lot of similarities in my mind, at least with the, 1920s. There's a lot of blaming people who are trying to find their humanity. I think a lot of the hysteria, maybe that's the
Mm.
wrong word to use, but, towards trans issues. Meanwhile, we have people who are looking to replace us with AI, upload their consciousness, go to Mars, live forever. They're redefining what it means to be human. And to me, they're kind of part and parcel of like missing the present. How
Yeah.
could you know what it means to be human when and that's the Sundays concert I described. Like I knew at that moment, I mean, as I just said the word, as I knew in that moment, I felt a shot of adrenaline because I knew in that moment, like, this is the best concert I've ever seen.
Right. Right.
I'm with this group of people. I remember some of the strangers who were staying next to me. I remember the people I met at that show. It's disappearing while it's happening. That's the music is like so exhilarating and always has that little undertow of melancholy because as it happens, it's gone. It's sound.
Yeah. And I think
It's
the
the people
longing,
right there in front of you.
yeah, and I think the longing for that experience and now is in part an experience of like, can I find something that happens that makes me forget about my phone for a while? And like,
Yeah.
I mean, I just went to, and this was a very recent show, a Queens of the Stone Age show,
Cool.
big loud rock show. They at the Santa Barbara Bowl, they actually I think took like a paid like a $27,000 fine at the end of it because they turned up their amps louder than they were legally allowed to. And you
That's
noticed it at
awesome.
some point,
That's a
like
pretty punk thing to do.
yeah, at some point halfway through the show, we just all noticed that it was like I was like those sound waves were actually like just completely enveloping your body. And
Yeah.
it's funny, ironically, it's not really captured on the YouTube video, but the last maybe, half of that show and particularly the last like three songs where they were just rocking out, there's no one has their phones out. Like everyone is just like in this sort of like ecstatic mosh pit moment. I felt
Mhm.
it myself. I was like sort of just forgot your phone and like that I think that longing tells you something a little bit of like kind of what people are looking for is a little bit of that ego loss of like that experience. It is kind of a to me like a privilege and a curse to live in our particular generational position where we're the people who remember the before times as much as we were
Yeah.
I mean we were teched out. I mean I went to college and email was happening and computers were all people talked about. I mean, Windows 95, right, was like in 95. And it's weird
Yeah.
to look at videos of like all these
Mick
dudes.
Jagger made some money off that.
Yeah, like and all these dudes
Start
like
me up.
lined up outside of like Best Buy or electronic stores to get Windows 95. I'm like, what were they doing on their computers? But it was an obsession at that time as well. So it's kind of like
Yeah.
careful what you wish for. But the other part of it like is the time part of it. I'm glad you mentioned podcasts because honestly, I lament like that I can't read a book anymore in the same way as I used to. I remember some of my most valuable memories of the 90s were sitting in coffee houses, like you say,
Hmm.
reading a novel for 6 hours and really not even just forgetting myself, forgetting that I had to go to the
Hmm.
bathroom even. But
Yeah.
now I'm trying to read all these James Elroy books, which are some of them are kind of complex in their language and everything. I'm sitting here reading and like I'm reading them and every 15 minutes, like sitting there picking up my phone and flicking through like Instagram or something. Like, why is that necessary? So I lament it for myself, but I'm also like, I'm glad you mentioned like podcasts and interviews because I never really considered that. But during this hour that you and I are talking here, like I don't look at my phone for an hour at all. Like I'm because part of me is just kind of like I want to be locked into what you're saying. I want to listen. I want to honor what you're saying, and I don't want to be like I don't know. I don't you don't want to be rude and like ignore someone by looking at
Hmm.
your phone. And so the conversational element is important, I think. And like
Hmm.
that part of it, like, going into a quiet classroom was always very scary to me. I'm like,
Yeah.
they're not talking at all. Because yeah, I have definitely gone into classrooms where everyone was talking and I'm like, yes, this is gonna be
Right.
fun, and it doesn't happen as much anymore. But it seems like I don't know. It seems like um, part of the phone, what it does is kind of bring out our worst impulses in some ways to ignore each
Hmm.
other and fall into that space. And that's why I think that brings out the kind of Luddite element of it. And it's not Luddite. I don't think that's the right term because again, like technology can be we've mentioned how we've used it in so many like valuable ways. I think it's more just kind of like that particular that particular like toxic scroll that's just I don't know. I've sat in cafes in Brooklyn and watched parents like flicking through TikTok while their kid is sitting in front of them like bored, like and I'm like they're ignoring their kid and what are they doing? They're not doing work, they're not doing anything in a value. They're doing the kind of thing that you would like do while you're on the toilet. You know what I mean? Like sort of like
I
like
do know what you mean.
like literally just fill the time. And yeah, I do think there is something about like being uncomfortable, being bored does sort of bring out a kind of imagination process that is cut off by the phone in some way or filled in.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I mean, I think, I'm more than happy to be here right now. And it really does exemplify the two sides. Because as you said, we're talking on a podcast and we're talking about an ebook. But honestly, this was like I like to walk and I like to, I'm a shower thinker. This was sort of a combination of the two during the pandemic. Was I was thinking like I don't want to lose the history of how I learned about music and appreciated certain experiences that were attached to people because I see the algorithms and the streaming encroaching on that. But I also wanted to connect like with new people, so there's a little bit of nostalgia. Like I'd love to connect with which I have done, connect with a few old friends with this project. But I think I was kind of imagining what we're doing right now. I didn't know you at the time, and I didn't know your podcast. I'm glad I did. I'm glad I got to know it. I'm glad Justin came on board, who I did know, because I was picturing like I still think music could be a kind of immersion into these kinds of conversations where it's sort of a safe space. And I mean, I think one of the things like I was talking about mentioning the Reynolds book is like I do love that my students aren't tied to genres like they
Yeah.
used to be. That and I mean, if I'm not a super expert. I did some research, and a lot of us know a little bit of, black music was called race music, and country music was called hillbilly music, and it was marketed from the beginning, and separating white jazz musicians, some of whom were racist, from black jazz, and all that. So it's fun to like not have students attached to that. But on the other hand, they don't do the research. So they just hear a song come through their streaming. They like it. They don't care, if the person, what their background is, if they're a queer person, if it's disco, if it's punk, they like that song. And that's kind of cool as a starting point. but I do think if, if educators are listening to this, I think what we're talking through, and because I just turned my grades in on Friday, so I'm kind of thinking about this, is creating spaces where you do have to be a little uncomfortable, where you have to talk to another person, where the artifact, whether it's a topic or music, creates conversations in real time. Because you're absolutely right. The farthest thing from my mind right now is, did I gain any blue sky followers or something like that? Because it's very immersive. And I think it is, for better or worse, I think it's somewhat, I mean, I think it can be a little bit sad, but I think it's also exciting because I don't feel antiquated. I feel like having this experience and definitely working with some of the younger folks who are, grad students on this project, like it's something really to offer from the before times. I think it's something like, and I do think that's what I was kind of getting at with sort of the Benjamin, like, we don't want to glorify record companies and we don't want to glorify payola on the radio. And we don't want, I think the Flaneur and Baudelaire, I mean, it came from the fundamental fact that capitalism makes waste. And
Yeah.
sometimes people are part of that waste. And the poet who has the privilege, and there's definitely been a lot of class and gender critiques of the flaneur, the person who has the leisure to go and look at an object, like, why did someone love this turtle that you pull on a string? And
Hmm.
who made it? And why was it discarded? And why is it here? And what does this mean? That can become a revolutionary or a life-changing thing, but it takes some work because you're starting with waste. And I do think the digital world leaves these weird tracks where things are neither dead nor alive. They just exist forever on a server, probably sucking up electricity somehow. The same thing with photographs. When you had to take pictures and you went and you hoped you didn't screw the roll up if you weren't a very good photographer,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you took it to the parking lot and then you got your pictures back. And I mean, there are whole years I don't have photos of friends and things because you didn't just take selfies when you went out to eat with your friends, and you didn't know it was the last time you're going to see them before they moved or whatever. So they have a certain value where you can see that. But I think we're not going back. So I think there is some kind of balance between like that potential that's, and part of it was wasteful, part of it existed on these categories, and it's good that we can critique them. But I do think there was something about that contemplation, that feeling of being uncomfortable, the feeling of being bored,
Mm.
um, and just the fact that it was a thing. There is something, there is an aura that attaches to a moment that's not recorded. There is an aura that attaches to a thing that came because of a relationship, or even if it was just the clerk talking to you about the album you bought, the vinyl or the CD. It lends a mystique to it, and if you see a band, I'm sure if you listen to uh, that group again, now that you've seen the show, the recording sounds different. You layer experience in a way that
Yeah.
you can't if you're just letting Spotify decide that you click like on a song and it gives you 10 more that are similar.
Yeah. It seems like there's more experiences that only exist in your mind, and that notion that you just mentioned of like not having photographs of a person that you forgot, that there's a tragedy to it, and there's part of me is like thinking about nostalgia as sort of like that collection of missing people or memories that
Right.
are only that don't have any sort of record to them, certainly no digital record, and that adds some layer to your life that it is, I mean, it does bother me in some ways. I do think about like I wish I had a picture of that person. I
Yeah.
wish I had a video of that person, but it still wouldn't be that person. It still wouldn't be that experience. And so like I don't know, in some ways nostalgia is longing for something that's just gone. And I think that I don't know, the discomfort I feel is in part the discomfort of knowing that life is passing you by constantly,
A
and that
hundred
it's
percent.
it's it's
Yeah.
a denial of death thing, I guess. Yeah.
I actually wrote, I know we don't have too much more time, but one of my other aphorisms was I think part of the same process is we think we're killing death
Yeah.
and we're just silencing it, and that's the thing. And I think for me, I tried to, I mean, it's a little tough being, I mean, Justin, he's a tough editor, by the way, man. If you work, I highly I don't know if he collaborates a lot or you can hire him as an editor for hire, but he's a great editor. But I was kind of in control of my essay, so I threw a lot in there that maybe it could have been shorter, but I was glad I gave myself time to explore some thoughts. And one of them was I, and kind of like I found your podcast, I got to know Justin better throughout this. When I was listening to all these Columbus, Ohio bands from the '90s, Spotify gave me Jenny May. I reached out to a friend of mine who lives in France now, I text pretty regularly, so it wasn't so hard. But he pointed me to a book of this guy Bellico who runs something called Anyway Records, and so there was like it kind of captures my feelings here because I wanted to know if I ever saw Jenny May live because it turned out she had died. She had a lot of mental health and addiction issues, and she died, I think, at age 47. And it's the pandemic. I'm just kind of thinking like, man, I really want to know, did I see her? Because I saw a lot of bands that she was affiliated with when I was there, and I'll never know probably
Hmm.
whether I did. That said, I read this guy Bellico's book. It was really interesting, kind of a dark book about his own troubles with addiction, his relationship with this singer Jenny May. But I found new music through that.
Yeah.
There's this really quirky guy. I'm forgetting his real name, but it's Saint Lennox is what he goes by. He's a Korean American lawyer who does like kind of weird folk, alternative folk and kind of music. So like I'm finding new things and I'm talking about new artists with people, and that's where I get back to love is research. So but as you point out, I think we're having a bit of a brain melt because I was thinking about it. Who would want to be bored? Who would want to be uncomfortable? Who would want to contemplate mortality when the alternative is think, well, I'll, I'll be entertained. I'll feel comfortable. I'll somehow feel like you're putting, mortality off to the
Yeah.
side.
Yeah.
We know it's an illusion, and I think that's why we have a little bit. I'm not going to. I know we're close to our time, but I don't know where the nihilism that we have comes from, our nihilism, but I do think it's sort of like this idea of we're killing death, and it comes back. I don't know if that's
It's funny.
Lacan or Zizek or Return of the Repressed, but it comes back.
It's like us for if we're the old men now, our equivalent of saying, I had to walk both ways uphill in the snow is telling young people like I had to sit around and be bored and think about my own mortality and death, and it was great. Like you're kind of like they're like, really? Was it? It
Really?
sounds
Huh.
it sounds like suffering. But yeah, this was really fun. It's the one thing that's coming to mind is that randomly the ending of the show 6 Feet Under on HBO. There's a moment where a character is leaving and going to New York, and she's like leaving her whole family behind and starting a new life in New York, and she's taking a whole bunch of pictures, and the ghost of her brother like leans into her, like the ghost of her brother. The show's about death, so he leans into her and like whispers in her ear like, stop taking pictures, you can't keep this, it's all gone already. And I
Hmm.
thought like, wow, that captures a little bit of what we're trying to think about in
Hmm.
this episode. I think is that like that sort of, yeah, coming to terms with the fact that life is a fleeting experience and that you can't just take a picture of it and put it online, and that means you've transcended death in some way.
You
And
have
yet
not.
we're trying.
We're trying. And I mean, there's an Amazon show upload. Maybe you think you're going to upload your consciousness, but I don't know. And that's why I don't know that that would be a human. I don't know what that would be if
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
Yeah. That's
And that is part of the moment. I mean, my son is taking a Spanish class, and this teacher is probably a lot younger than me. It's like a film class, so he has probably a subscription AI. He loaded this director's biography, and he created an AI where the students chatted with an AI avatar of a famous Spanish film director. And my son thought
wow.
it was cool because it uses his words.
Yeah.
It sounds like him. I can't think. My first reaction is not that that's cool. It's sort of like what we're talking about. Like, is that what's a human being? If I wanted to just, I'm sure I could do that right now. Just say,
Yeah.
Charlie Chaplin, what do you made those movies. What do you think about
That's not Charlie
that?
Chaplin. That's
And
the
maybe
thing.
we
Yeah,
with this,
yeah. It's artificial intelligence is the wrong word for it. And Justin has, speaking of like, conversations you have over text, Justin and I talk a lot about AI. And one of the recent things he said to me is that very thing, which is like, it's not really artificial intelligence. It's really just kind of, it hasn't created a new sentience.
no,
It's just a search engine that's essentially, curating answers that sound like something Charlie Chaplin might say, but Charlie's gone, and you didn't
it's
bring him
gone.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you described, and I mean this, again, I thank you for having me here. This is exactly what I actually imagined, which
Yeah.
is being immersed with someone's thoughts who may, and you and I had I I think, and having listened to your podcast, I'm not surprised had quite a bit of overlap. But being in someone else's space and their thoughts, even if it is, and again, we're on Zoom talking
Yep.
on a podcast about an ebook, but I really appreciate and I certainly reciprocate, giving my full attention to you and you giving your attention to me. And that's something totally different. And I think the fact that there's a longing for it, I have no idea how to define human nature, but I do think there are lessons to be learned from the different ways we experience this and the way technology has kind of taken over the story. Sometimes it's the story, it's not the medium, and I probably read Marshall McLuhan the most people dissertation, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's the medium is the message, but sometimes the story really transcends the message and there's something more fundamental, so. And I think music, the fact that it captures euphoria, shared experience, and I mean, that's what I meant earlier, like about the 1920s. Like, I never thought I would live through that period. Like, when I would read things about people freaking out because they hear a voice, it's a phone, or, those famous
Mm-hmm.
descriptions. Well, you took film theory, about people fleeing from the trains on the screen, thinking they're going to pop through and kill them in the theater. I never thought I would have to say that's not Charlie Chaplin. It's his words mashed through an algorithm. It's not
Right.
him. You know what I mean? We don't know. It's similar. There's a certain parallel there between the 1920s and now. And I think those of us like yourself and myself who studied history and culture and the way people want to meet and talk, I think that does have to be recreated. I wish it would be natural, but if it's not, then I think these kinds of fora where we can cultivate that, whether it's
Yeah.
in the classroom, talking to people, we don't have to be totally like-minded, but I think to have some shared reference points is really a powerful thing. And that's why I'm so thankful also for these artists for kind of creating these lasting artifacts where people today want to hear the music of the 90s.
Yeah.
It's
And
having a
and
moment, it's never going to go away.
yeah, and even if they're hearing it in a short clip on TikTok, the longing for it is what's really important. And there's a seed of something human there. God, you've given me a lot to think about, and there's a lot more for listeners to check out. I'll again put the link in the episode description to this great ebook curated by David Humphries. Thank you for joining me. It's called Happy Nostalgia. Got a lot of CUNY Graduate Center scholars in there. But it was really fun to read, and I appreciate you coming on and talking with me about
Thanks
it.
so much for having me, David. The power of David squared, I guess.
Thank you. Well, okay, my friends, I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap this week, our first episode of 2025. I hope you are doing well, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation with David Humphries as much as I did. Again, I urge you to check out Happy Nostalgia, Making Connections with the Music of the 90s. This is a really fun set of essays, made me think a lot. And again, we will be talking more about it when Justin comes on the show to talk about Blind Melon, and I think we'll probably be talking with other authors from this set as well, because nostalgia is what we do, and I can't get enough of 90s music, and particularly I'd like to talk about specific artists. So I wonder who are your favorite weird artists of the 90s that we might have missed? I know everyone talks about the big hits like Nirvana and grunge and all the kind of big hip hop stuff, but what are sort of like dark corners of the 90s music scene that pop out to you? Leave those in our comments. I'm usually on Instagram and YouTube and other social media networks. I appreciate you finding us, especially on our Patreon page. I appreciate all the subscribers that are helping support us. And if you want to do that, the link is in the episode description as well. So, all right, we will see you again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.